So storm bolters, stubbers and hunter killer missiles, are they worth bringing on the top of your tanks? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today we're talking about a few vehicle upgrades and whether or not they make all that much sense in 9th edition. First we'll talk about storm bolters and heavy stubbers, and then move on to hunter killer missiles. So storm bolters and heavy stubbers can be taken on top of quite a lot of tanks, and act as kind of an incidental boost to anti-infantry firepower. In 8th edition they were typically very cheap indeed, usually 2 or 3 point upgrades, but now they've gone up a bit in 9th, they're typically 5 points each. I certainly wouldn't consider them too hard as to whether or not you actually take vehicles in your army, but if as part of your strategy you are running a few rhino tanks for example, maybe delivering some Repentia or Khorne berserkers, or if you happen to have a few gunline battle tanks in your backfield, I find them an interesting little calculation to weigh up whether you should include them. Typically, on a purely point-for-point basis, you're going to get more value out of them on higher ballistic skill platforms. If you happen to be paying the exact same points for something, say paying 3 points for a Storm Bolter in Astra Militarum, you're going to get more value out of it when it's on a tank commander with ballistic skill 3+, and maybe re-rolling 1s, compared with something with a standard ballistic skill of 4+. At the really quite low points cost that they come in at, typically they will have a decent chance of making their points back if they get to fire once or twice against some light or medium infantry. I think they are fairly well balanced as they go between leaving them off or keeping them on, so in particular if you are rolling forward with your vehicles, I think they'll typically give you some fairly good value, but if you're staying back or maybe hiding out of line of sight, then I'd argue not so much. It also depends on just exactly how much anti-infantry firepower you already have in your army. A few extra storm bolters or heavy stubbers could actually be really valuable if you're a bit tight, but if you've got absolutely oodles of bolt shots or lasfire, then it might not be quite as good a buy. If you are a bit more limited though, and are focused on a fair few more heavy guns on your tanks, they can be quite helpful as just little problem solver type guns, where you might be able to throw them into one injured unit and maybe finish them off, and stop some of your more important units from having to divert any firepower. For Space Marines, typically we get Storm Bolters on standard vehicles for 5 points, you get 2 shots at 24 inches or 4 at 12, so the range is a bit on the short side, but I would typically pick them up if you've got vehicles that are going to be advancing into the midfield, things like Rhinos. For Astra Militarum, the Storm Bolters only cost 3 points, and I'd argue that they're fairly good value on things like Hellhounds or Chimeras, and synergize quite well with their weapons. For Primaris vehicles, we get Iron Hail Heavy Stubbers, which for the same 5 points just have a far better profile. 4 shots at 36 inches at strength 4, AP-1. It's just a really good value gun for 5 points, and I would take them on my Impulsors or wherever else I could get them. For Guard Heavy Stubbers, they're also 5 points, but unfortunately far inferior, only 3 shots at 36 inches at strength 4. I suspect that when we get the new codex they will go up to 4 shots though. For me, I'd go with the Storm Bolter over these for advancing tanks, and I'd actually most consider heavy stubbers on things like tank commanders. Provided you can keep those commanders alive, these will typically pay for themselves in a turn or two. I'd typically leave them off things like Basilisks and Manticores though, as you don't really want to be exposing them to enemy fire if you have the choice. Overall, I'd say that 5 point Storm Bolters are kind of well balanced, and I could happily take or leave on advancing vehicles. Iron Hail Heavy Stubbers are kind of undercosted, and I'd pick them up wherever I can, and Guard Heavy Stubbers are a little on the pricey side. I'd think about them most on a tank commanders. Now let's talk about Hunter Killer Missiles. These got a bit of a bump in the War Gear upgrade FAQ, and they're now 48 inches, strength 10, AP-2, and damage D6. They'll typically cost you 5 points whether you're Space Marines or Astra Militarum. Much like Storm Bolters and Stubbers, you'll get more value out of those 5 points if they're being fired by something that can hit well. Ballistic skill 3+ or even better is great, and also anything that can get reroll 1s to hit, which will depend on exactly what sort of army or chapter you're bringing. In particular though, Space Marines kind of have some special synergy with Hunter Killer Missiles, as they get the Devastator Doctrine turn 1, and turn 1 is typically when you're going to want to fire them, as they're kind of a tool to add to your Alpha Strike. With Hunter Killer Missiles you want to be firing them off turn 1 if at all possible, as you're essentially paying the points to front load the damage output of your army. Perhaps a decent volley of Hunter Killer Missiles could down an enemy tank, then that tank won't be able to hit you back in their turn, and you'll have gained an early advantage in the battle straight away. Some units can take some quite meaningful amounts of Hunter Killer Missiles as well, such as the Leviathan Dreadnought that can take 3. You're kind of giving it another really decently powerful anti-tank weapon that's only going to be used on 1 turn. In terms of the maths of the damage output for Hunter Killer Missiles, when you're firing up Ballistic Skill 3+, you'll do around about 1 wound to a toughness 7 or 8 vehicle per missile that you include. Obviously the missiles are very swingy, either you hit and wound or you don't, and then you get a random d6 damage after that, so they are kind of all or nothing things. But it means that, say, if you had 6 hunter-killer missiles across your army, you could, on average, over the course of several games, expect around about 6 wounds on turn 1 against those targets. Generally, this is fairly good news for their value, though. Most vehicles tend to cost 10 or more points per wound, which means that you are likely to be killing more wounds of vehicle than you spend in hunter-killer missiles, and that really long range can potentially allow you to engage some targets that you might have struggled to on turn 1. I remember having one nasty surprise in 8th edition, where I thought I'd deployed one of my tanks out of range of the enemy's army, completely forgetting that there were about 9 hunter-killer missiles that could all shoot it. Probably the biggest downside to hunter-killer missiles, though, are that several matchups will have some fairly suboptimal targets for them. Plenty of Space Marine lists can just be quite infantry-focused. You might be playing against a horde that has literally no vehicles whatsoever, or you might only have very, very light vehicles to target with, which are kind of waste for such high-power anti-tank weapons, much like Stormbolters and Stubbers being best for anti-infantry. If your army struggles against tanks, then hunter-killer missiles are going to have more value. Overall, though, I think they certainly can be worth it with the strength boost, particularly on Ballistic Skill 3 platforms that have some manner of rerolls built in. They're particularly good on things like Salamanders, for example, who have that reroll on every single unit, and it can make a lot of sense to use that reroll on a Strength 10 anti-tank rocket. Overall, though, when I'm making the calculations about the hunter-killer missiles and Stormbolters, and whether or not I want to include them, I try not to let either of them distract you from the vehicle's main purpose. You don't want to be exposing a vehicle to an enemy charge just because you move them closer to fire your Stormbolter a bit better, and you don't really want to be exposing your artillery tanks to the front line just to fire one additional hunter-killer missile. I'd say the majority of top tournament lists tend to try not to be distracted by these, and they tend to leave them off, though I personally think that they are a little bit underrated, and can provide you with some cheap and efficient firepower, and can give you a few more handy tools for dealing with problematic enemy units. So let me know what you think of them down in the comments below. Do you take hunter-killers and Stormbolters on your vehicles, or do you tend to leave them off? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for more like this. And if you have been enjoying regularly, I would just like to mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Making all of these videos does take a fair amount of time, and if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain new videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and also automatic entry to the Auspex Tactics prize giveaway, which happens once a month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.